want to welcome you to my session on Azure IaaS Essentials for the BizTalk Developer. My name is Stephen Thomas. Also want to welcome everyone on the live stream and make sure everyone keeps in mind the live stream adds at least 20 pounds. So when you come in person next year, you'll see me much thinner. So don't be shocked by that. A little bit about me. I'm a 12-year integration MVP. Used to be BizTalk MVP, then we're integration MVP. I guess now we're actually Azure MVPs. So our MVP status has kind of morphed over time. I'm also a Pluralsight author. I have a couple courses out there now on BizTalk. I have a new course coming out in about 2 months on BizTalk server administration. So if you have a Pluralsight subscription, make sure you look for that. I run the community site, biztalkgurus.com, and also run the site, biztalkguru.com. I'm on Twitter at Stephen W. Thomas, and you can email me anytime at me@biztalkgurus.com. So I want to get started with a quick recap of my experience here at the Integrate Summits. I won't go into as much detail as Dan did, but 2 years ago was the first time I presented here, and I talked on Windows IaaS. I went pretty deep into a set of PowerShell scripts on how to auto-generate a BizTalk domain with virtual machines inside of IaaS. Anybody that remembers, we had just had our second child about 3 weeks before. So coming here, having fun with all of you guys, put me in the doghouse with my wife back at home. Then last year, I came here and talked about the top 14 integration challenges that I've came across in my 14 years of doing integration. Timing of the conference was really well, so I was out of the doghouse. I felt like a smart-looking George Clooney. And now this year, I'm back again to talk about the power of infrastructure as a service. It's amazing how much it's changed in the past 2 years. 2 years ago, we only had a handful of virtual machine options, and now we have enough content where I could have talked on virtual machines for 2 days, and everybody would have been totally bored. The timing of this conference is not the best. Yesterday, the lady who takes care of our kids just left for her week-and-a-half-long honeymoon, and my mother-in-law just flew in. So as you can imagine, I am back in the doghouse again. So once it comes up, don't install updates. Okay, back in the doghouse. Okay, so what's Azure IaaS? So Azure IaaS is Microsoft's infrastructure as a service offering. It allows us to provision infrastructure resources when we need it, and we only pay for the items that we actually provision. It allows us to scale on demand on the infrastructure side in terms of networking and virtual machines, and we have basically unlimited capacity to grow as large as we need on the infrastructure side. We also have the ability to use both the portal to create our resources or script things in PowerShell, which gives us a lot of flexibility to actually embed infrastructure in our build processes and in our development process to have that resources automatically created for us instead of having to rely on other teams to build out these resources. So let's get started with what are the business advantages of using infrastructure as a service. So first off, it's about lower costs. So about 6 years ago, so just to give you an example of my personal experience, 6 years ago, I spent about $1,200 building a new server at home just to run my virtual machines. In addition to the cost of having to build that hardware, I also had to spend a lot of time building my pre-built templates around Windows and BizTalk Server, and every time a new release of Windows or BizTalk came out, I had to build new templates. With IaaS, we have the ability to use their hardware just for the amount of time we need it, and we have the ability to use their pre-built templates, which allows us to lower costs, both our personal costs if we want to do development at home, and costs for our business, as they don't have to expend money for capital expenditures on the hardware. We also have the ability to scale as needed. So if today I need a small virtual machine just to play around with, I can have that. And then I can take that very same virtual machine and turn it into a large powerhouse simply by changing the size of that virtual machine. There's also some accounting advantages, especially in the US as it relates to capital expenditure costs of hardware. Since we're dealing as a service here, we have different options of how we can account for that. as compared to having to buy large servers, store them in our data center, and then depreciate them over time. So let's talk about some of the challenges we face, kind of with Azure in general. First off, every once in a while, they'll release some breaking changes. This more relates to when you script things on the PowerShell side. But since I've been working with IaaS for over 3.5 years, I've seen my fair share of things that just don't work anymore in the portal, and some virtual machines that kind of went stale. And it's kind of challenging to keep track of new things when they come out and make sure everything still works. Things also change fairly quickly. So if you haven't looked at the portal in about 6 or 9 months, you won't even recognize it when you log in. So this is also a good thing because there are new things constantly available, but it can also be frustrating because every once in a while you go back in expecting to do something and then you're confused because you have 25 more options now. And then every once in a while, preview items will tend to vanish. Some things come out in preview, they look very exciting. Most of the time they're replaced by something better that goes under a new name, but every once in a while things you become accustomed to will end up vanishing in the portal. So pretty much every project I've been at, there's always some sort of hostility between the BizTalk devs and IT pros that are responsible for the BizTalk infrastructure. Always some sort of tension there. The IT pros say it's bad code from the developers. Developers say the IT pros just don't understand what they're doing to begin with. So it begs the question do you really know if you're a developer-focused person or are you an IT pro-focused person? So I came up with a very simple test. If there's 2 sessions going on at Integrate at the exact same time, one by Nino and one by Tord, if you go to Nino's session, you're probably developer-focused. If you go to Tord's section, you're probably IT pro-focused. So while I love everybody in Tord's session, we're more focused on the developer influence of IaaS in this presentation. So as I see it, Azure IaaS is about putting the power of infrastructure in the hands of developers. Now, I'm not saying we go out and run our production BizTalk server without telling anybody in the cloud and put that all on our virtual machine, but what I am saying is we can now do simple things like provision a virtual machine to use for development, to use for testing, without having to involve our IT pro resources. Some of the things that this is very beneficial for is creating an isolated multi-server domain to test a multi-server deployment process. I don't know about anybody else, but every time I go to a client and say I want to test my deployment process, give me a multi-server BizTalk domain to test this on, after they stop laughing, they say it'll be 3 to 4 weeks and cost them thousands of dollars. You can stand that up in Azure in about 60 minutes at a cost of just a few dollars. So there's 2 key components of Azure Infrastructure as a Service. There's a networking component, which is related to internal Azure networking to relate virtual machines to each other, as well as connectivity between your on-premise data center and your Azure resources. Things like ExpressRoute can be set up to seamlessly connect your data center with your Azure resources. We're not going to focus too much on the networking side of things here. We're going to focus on the virtual machine side, which, as everyone knows, is just the concept of running your virtual machines in the cloud. So let's get started with a quick look at the different sizes of virtual machines. So 2 years ago when I talked, there was only 5 or 6 sizes of virtual machines now. Now we have something that looks like alphabet soup with so many different sizes of virtual machines available. When you go create a new virtual machine, you have over 58 options on just the size of your virtual machine to create. So let's quickly look at what are the advantages and disadvantages of the different sizes. So the A is the original size. It has less CPU resources than the other, but of course it's going to be the cheapest. It has low to moderate bandwidth. And honestly, I've never been happy with the performance of any of my A-size virtual machines. So I tend to stay away from the A virtual machines. As we get into the D series, they have a faster CPU than A. They have a local SSD temp storage that can be accessed. They have higher bandwidth as compared to A, but they do not have support for premium storage. We'll get into premium storage a little bit more later on. The DS series has both a DS and a DSV2 size. These tend to be your best value. The V2 series has a 35% faster CPU. It allows for high bandwidth between virtual machines, and it does have support for premium storage. It does have vastly increased IOPS as well. So how many people here know what an IOP is? So my first experience with IOPS happened 5 or 6 years ago when we had some SQL performance issues. So you tend to run into IOPS when you're looking at the churn of the disk. So IOPS stands for input-output per second. So it kind of is a measure of what's going on with your disk. The more IOPS, the better. We'll talk more about that in just a moment as well. And then we have the G and GS series, which is the largest and most powerful. These start at $450 a month. And I've never really had a need for these in terms of a dev test scenario for working with the virtual machines. So let's talk about virtual machine performance. So how many people here have never created a virtual machine in Azure? Okay, at least a few people, luckily. How many people have created a virtual machine and been so unhappy with your performance that you said you'd never do it again? Okay, at least some people, thank you. So let's talk about the things that impact the performance of our virtual machines in Azure. So first and foremost, there's CPU and RAM. But when it comes to CPU and RAM, it's less about the quantity and more about the quality of your CPU and RAM. So as we get into looking at the different sizes of virtual machines, obviously the A is going to have a less quality CPU as, say, the DS series. So when I tend to make my virtual machines, I tend to avoid anything that's a 0 or a 1, unless there's a specific reason. Maybe if I have a domain controller that I don't really care about too much, I'll spin that up as a 1 size. The other thing that impacts performance is your disks and your IOPS. So in terms of IOPS, Azure actually throttles down the IOPS on your disks to be around 500 per second. So that gives you the ability to live within that limitation, and when you need more IOPS than that, they want you to go to a larger virtual machine size. So the way they want you to gain more disk performance with the lower end virtual machines is you attach multiple disks. So when you look at the sizing charts of the virtual machines, it tells you what's the max amount of disks that can be attached to that virtual machine. Each one of those disks is going to give you 500 IOPS. And if you want to give it an idea of what 500 IOPS really means, so to get the performance of the throughput on a disk that you get with your SSD drive and your laptop, you generally have to go with something around a DS5 or better to have the same throughput that you would get on your laptops. So IOPS are important. If you need more performance, scale out with more disks. The other factor that comes into play with performance is the bandwidth. Just like we saw with IOPS, Azure actually throttles the bandwidth down to smaller sizes of virtual machines. So again, if you need more bandwidth, you have to go with a larger size virtual machine. And they tend to talk about the bandwidth in terms of moderate or high, different levels of what the bandwidth is, but they don't really tell you what the actual throughput of that is going to be. So just to give you an idea, a high rating of a bandwidth is about 1 gigabit per second. The top-notch level they have for bandwidth is actually called Extreme. So right now, Extreme is going to give you the most best performance in terms of bandwidth through your system. So extremely high is extreme strong word. So when they come up with something better than extremely high, I'm not really sure where they're going to go with that. Very extremely high, I guess. So what do I recommend in terms of creating a new virtual machine? I always go with the DS2 V2 with premium storage. And if you're using your MSDN account, you can get this for around $110 per month. Now that's if you left your virtual machine on the whole time. So if you only used it for about 8-10 hours a day, you're looking at probably about half this in terms of cost of your virtual machine. And we'll get into a little bit more on the MSDN in just a second. So to make things more complex, there's two styles of virtual machines as you look at it in infrastructure as a service. There's the classic mode of virtual machines. These are what came out first. These are hosted inside a cloud service. They don't have to be attached to a virtual network. They have a backup feature. They are basically the older way to do virtual machines. The newer way is the resource manager-based virtual machines. These get assigned an IP address. They get attached to a resource group, and you have the ability to control that virtual machine a lot better. Everything is attached into your resource group, so your storage, your virtual machine will all be right there. And In the classic mode, everything's kind of scattered throughout your subscription. So going forward, you should always use the resource manager-based approach to creating the virtual machines. So I mentioned a little bit about storage. There's a basic storage, which is the storage we know and love inside Azure, which is just there. Then we have this idea of premium storage. Premium storage is SSD-based storage, and it's done a little bit differently than the basic storage. Basic storage, we pay per gigabyte that we have in that storage account. Premium storage, we basically pre-block a certain size of SSD drive. So there's 3 different sizes of premium storage, P1, P2, and P3, and they have different restrictions in terms of IOPS, bandwidth, throughput, and obviously costs. When you create a DS-V2 with premium storage virtual machine, by default, it puts your operating system disk on a P1 SSD premium storage device, and that works out pretty well. If you want a little bit better performance out of your virtual machine, you could use a basic disk for that for your operating system, create a premium storage disk and attach that and put all your resource-intensive, read-write-intensive operations on that premium storage disk to get a little bit better performance. Because once your OS loads, you don't really need to need that disk performance for that. The cost of this is a little bit different. Like I said, you're paying for the whole 128 gigabyte block, whether or not you use it all, and these are charged per month. Now the charge is also per hour, so if you use a premium disk for half the month and delete it, you're only going to be charged for $10 if that's a P1 size. Using the premium storage disks and attaching them to your virtual machines, the max IOPS you can get is 80,000 IOPS, which is a lot. I mentioned a little bit before about some MSDN benefits. You do get some discounts, service discounts by creating virtual machines using your MSDN subscription. You get discounts off the published rates of what I've seen of up to 50%. And there's no upcharge for premium SKUs. So if you go out and create an enterprise BizTalk server, you're not charged that extra money for the enterprise SKU, you're just charged at the basic virtual machine price. You also get access to some exclusive images, which is kind of exciting. There's a Windows 10 image that you have access to out there, and then some of the BizTalk Developer images, I don't know if they still are, used to be exclusive to MSDN users. Now there are restrictions. They do not allow production tasks to run under your MSDN account, and they have the right to shut down any resource that runs for 120 hours or more continuously. So keep that in mind. If you ever leave a virtual machine on and you see it shut down, they reserve the right to do that. So what are the best practices when it comes to creating virtual machines and working with them? First and foremost is make sure you turn off your virtual machine when you're not using it. You're still charged for your virtual machine as long as it is running. If you shut it down, then you're no longer charged for that virtual machine. If you don't remember to do this, you can always create an automate script inside Azure that'll run every night and shut down your virtual machines. And also, it's always important to clean up your subscriptions. Once you're done using a virtual machine, make sure you clean it up and delete it, delete the disks, because you are charged for some of those resources like the storage, and you don't want your Azure subscription to look like mine, where I don't understand what half the storage accounts in there are used for. So always best when you're done with it, clean up your subscription. So we're going to do a quick demo of how we create a virtual machine inside the Azure portal. Most of you may have done this before, so I won't spend a whole lot of time going through it. Okay, once we're back in our portal, we can see here on the side there's two types of virtual machines. We have the classic mode, which will list our older classic virtual machines, and our new virtual machines that are associated with resource groups just under virtual machines. To create a new one, we would just come under New, click Add, and there's a whole host of pre-built templates for us to start with. We saw yesterday the RabbitMQ. If we wanted to spin up a RabbitMQ environment, we could just look to see if there's a template for that. And it's searching, and sure enough, there's a pre-built RabbitMQ template that we would simply select that, spin it up as a virtual machine, and we don't have to worry about installing RabbitMQ, configuring the environment, getting it to work. We can instantly start working with that. There's many things available in BizTalk. Sarvana mentioned that there's a BizTalk 360 image, so we see that here. If we wanted to play with that, we simply provision a virtual machine using that template. But we'll just take a look at Windows. And we'll just go with the data center edition. And here you have the option of how you want to deploy this virtual machine. You can choose Classic or the Resource Manager-based virtual machine. I'm going to go ahead and say Resource Manager. And now we're going to be presented with a few different ways we want to configure this virtual machine. We need to give it a name. We have to create our admin user and give it a password. We can select what subscription we want this to be associated with. If we have multiple subscriptions, you'll see them here in the drop-down. I'm just going to leave it to where it's at. And here we can assign this virtual machine to an existing resource group if we wanted, or we can create a new resource group. We'll create a new one. And I'm going to first put it in the East US data center. And let's take a look at our sizing options and estimated costs. Once it comes up. Okay. And now it's going to give me my list of 58 different sizing options to pick from once it gets done loading. Seems to be taking a break. It is 2:30 in the morning over there, so they're probably doing an update. Okay, well, I won't spend more time going through this. It doesn't seem to be working right now. Once you get your sizing options, the one thing that I wanted to point out was the data center that you pick will influence the cost of your virtual machine. I'm not really sure why. There's a difference in US-based data centers, but if you pick East US, for example, the DS virtual machine will run you $108 a month. If you pick the South Central data center, it runs you $94 a month. So apparently on the East Coast, you're paying for the view, must be overlooking Manhattan skyline. Down in the deserts of Texas, apparently things are cheaper on the infrastructure side. The other thing I want to point out is when you get down under settings, you have the ability to attach different extensions to your virtual machines. These are essentially agents that will run with your virtual machines. The one that I'm most excited about is the Chef extensions. Chef allows you to essentially script the way your virtual machines will end up being configured. So I think it was Richard that said yesterday we should never have to do any manual steps to provision an environment exactly the way we want it. With Chef, we have the ability to kind of do that. We can create a Chef script and say, I want to create IaaS, or I want to create IaaS with these settings, enable, IaaS 6 management extensions, and it will do that for you. So now we've completed that demo, let's talk about what do we want to do when we're not using the portal to create our virtual machines. Anything you can do in the portal, you can do in PowerShell, and actually you can do a lot more in PowerShell than you can do in the portal. They're getting a lot better at having parity between the two. Back in the olden days, you had to use PowerShell to do a vast majority of infrastructure tasks. Now a lot more of that functionality is available in the portal. But like we saw with virtual machines, there's two styles of PowerShell. There's a classic mode and there's a resource manager mode. And this allows us to operate on our classic artifacts and operate on our resource-based artifacts. We have the concept that we saw over the past couple of days of resource manager templates. This allows us to create a collection of artifacts and group them together so that we can deploy them together. So if we wanted to create a multi-server BizTalk environment, we could create that inside of a resource manager template and be able to consistently and redeploy that as many times as we want into Azure. So as I said, everything is scripted and reproducible. We're going to take a quick look at the resource manager templates. I'm actually going to do that at the end because I seem to have all kinds of issues transitioning back and forth. So what other stuff have I been working on in terms of IaaS? Full domain scripts. If you remember from 2 years ago, I have some PowerShell scripts that creates a full BizTalk domain in IaaS. Anybody that wants to download those, you can go to biztalk.guru/BT-IaaS, and I have some documentation about how to use them. They are classic-based scripts, so I'm currently working on moving them into resource manager-based templates. The documentation was done by me, a BizTalk developer, so keep that in mind. Future work, as I said, I want to port my scripts into the resource manager template and build chef scripts to allow us to take a base Windows virtual machine and provision that exactly how we want. So now I'll jump over real quick again and take a look at the resource manager templates. Here in Visual Studio, you would create a resource manager template under File, New, Project, and it's under C# Cloud Azure Resource Group. And there's just a JSON-based file. It allows you to make external items available as parameters, so at runtime you can change values such as virtual machine names, user IDs, and passwords. You have variables, and then here you have resources. It gives you this JSON outline to allow you to add new resources as you want. You can see here we have like a SQL Server, and we have a domain controller. I can add new resources by right-clicking, add new resource. And this is going to give me a list of all the Azure artifacts that I can assign to this resource group. And using this, I can create my full domain build-out templates so I can reuse them over and over. So I won't go into this in too much detail. So with that, is there any questions? Yes?
Why are you using or promoting to use Chef rather than PowerShell design state configuration?
That's a good question. I just happen to be more affiliated with Chef-based processes. It just looked more exciting. For those of you that don't know, Chef doesn't just make food. They also do basically desired state configuration on IaaS. Just happened to be one of my clients was using that, so it just seemed to be a good choice. Desired state configuration will do similar things as well. So, anything else? Okay, thank you.